So yeah, thank you for jumping on here tonight. I'd like to introduce Dr. Tara Dunn, who is a doctor of naturopathic medicine. She also has her master's in health and wellness. Her focus is on human performance. So if you want to get better, just go see her. And certified sport nutritionist and Ironman sport nutritionist. So a wealth of knowledge, and we're very grateful to have her sharing her time and knowledge with us here today on a topic that uh, I think is incredibly interesting with all the complex things that happen in our body with training and well, heck, just life. I think hormones is one of the least understood, at least by athletes, and the impact that it has, and things that you can do to train better and train smarter. So I was incredibly excited to uh, hear about this topic tonight, and I was really excited that Tara was going to deliver it. So that's all I'll ramble on for. Sorry. There you
Thank
go.
you, Corey.
Bar
That was
low as
very
possible.
bar slow. Keep the bar
You
low. We will carry on with some information. Thanks everybody for joining today. I'll probably look in this direction a lot because that's the direction where I can see everybody, and I'm instead of where I should be looking. So forgive me for that. But I would like to dive right in because we have a lot of things to talk about, and I have scaled things back to try to not take up all your time tonight. But I'm very, very excited to talk about this topic. We're going to be talking about training female physiology, and let me make sure my clicker wants to work on here. Here we go. Specifically, we're going to be talking about nutrition and training strategies as they relate to women's hormones and female hormones. You guys can all hear me okay. Yeah, thumbs up. Thanks, Jennifer. Just to qualify me being here, Corey already covered the majority of things. My name's Dr. Tara Dunn. I usually just go by Dr. T. I will respond to, you can call me Tara. I'll respond to Beyonce. You can call me whatever you want. But I went to school for too long. Corey mentioned bachelor's, master's, my doctorate. Things I am most excited about in medicine is things pertaining to sport medicine. So in my private practice, I do focus on sport medicine with respect to biochemistry and physiology. So I'm very excited to chat today. Our topics today, let's make sure my clicker is going to work. We're just going to go over some basic physiological differences as they relate to sport. Understanding hormone cycles. This is going to be a big piece, and we'll talk about why, of course, how your hormones are going to impact your training. We're going to talk about female physiology and nutrition strategies, recovery specific to female physiology, and then we're absolutely going to touch on perimenopause and menopause and changes that will also happen during that age and stage of our life. I am happy that Corey mentioned it's an interesting part of sports medicine that we don't necessarily spend too much time thinking about, or have a great push from even trainers and coaches and other practitioners, because the reality is in sport medicine, female-driven research makes up 3 to 4% of sport medicine research, and the rest of it's all male data. And that has been because the menstrual cycle is a conundrum, or because our hormones are too complex to figure out. But really, we kind of produce similar hormones and similar fluctuations through the month. So I don't think it should be that challenging to take it into consideration and especially push the information so that we can perform our absolute best and recover our absolute best. So this is a classic picture of an iceberg. And I'm putting this in here because, like I said, I scaled so much back from our talk because it's a massive topic of conversation. If we could take a weekend and just have an entire weekend-long seminar about female hormones and how they relate to sport. I think then we might be able to cover it all. We're just touching on some general things and some things that I think will be super helpful. But if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out and we can chat about whatever else we missed today. Okay, I do want to make sure that I mention what we'll be talking about today. We're going to be talking about physiological differences between biological male, so XY, and biological female. Obviously, we live in a culture where people can identify in a different way, born one way, identify a different way, and I fully respect that. And I just want to make sure that I don't offend anyone with any terminology that I might get wrong, because I'm definitely still learning some of the shifts. But this is it with respect to anyone who's still producing from birth or is still producing estrogens and progesterones as a biological female would. So that will be the terminology I use. And again, if you have any questions about the way I presented, please feel free to contact me. But we're going to be talking about some differences, male and female. Obvious differences, you know, women are commonly smaller, commonly lighter. We have a higher proportion of body fat. We think about the breasts, the hips, the thighs. Those are some things that are a little bit more obvious. Those are our reproductive fat stores. We have differences in our shoulder angles, and we also have a different center of gravity, which makes a difference when you're buying a bike, let's say, and that's why they have differences between men and women's bikes, is our center of gravity is different. Same with buying shoes. They take those things into consideration. Women and weight, we tend to have a lot of fluctuations in our weight, and it can happen overnight. We can have a 2 to 8 pound change to our weight. It's always going to depend on our fluid intake, how much or what things we eat in a day. And I really wanted to make sure I focused on this point, how much glycogen is stored in our muscles. So we talk a lot about access to energy and carbohydrates, and we store those as glycogen in both our muscle and our liver and in other places. But for every 1 gram of glycogen that you store, your body is also going to store 3 grams of water. The fitter you become, the more you have a greater capacity to store glycogen. So then you're also going to have more water that's stored. So while you're training, you're feeling fitter, you're feeling stronger, but the scale's going up, and someone will say, oh, it's muscle, it's water. This is why it is. It's muscle. It's actually glycogen stored and water being stored. Women and muscle, we actually, so men and women, males and females, we have the same muscle composition generally. So as far as type 1 versus type 2 muscle fibers go, those anaerobic versus power fibers, we have the same percentage, but for females, our type 1 endurance fibers are the larger fibers. And in males, the type 2 power fibers are the largest. So we are actually very, very well built for endurance. And if you took power out of racing, then we could easily go head to head and beat the male population, I think, with just endurance. Women in fat, this is a word that nobody wants to hear sometimes because of media, but we do need fat. We can't train, we can't race, we can't live without fat. And especially when we talk about females, it's the fat that's under our skin that we see the most and we dislike the most. But that's important fat because it also helps us to regulate hormone production. It generates key hormones. One of the main ones is called adenopectin, and adenopectin actually regulates your insulin. So the movement of your blood sugar and the use of your blood sugar for fuel depends on adenopectin, which depends on fat. So we need some fat, not a lot, but we do need some. And you can see on my slide here, the differences between males and females. In men, it's a lower percentage, and in females, it's about 3 times as much. So we do need some fat. Other physiological differences, we have sex differences from birth. So today we're going to be talking a lot about hormones and thinking about puberty and the hormone shifting and things that apply there. But we also have differences from birth. So obviously there's, again, morphological changes. So we have smaller hearts, smaller lungs, which means we have lower oxygen carrying capacity, and we'll also have less hemoglobin. We carry the majority of our lean mass in our lower body. But metabolic differences, women are born with more protein in their mitochondria. So you think about the powerhouse or the engine of every cell in your body. We have more protein in there, which means we have a better capacity to access fatty acids and use fat for fuel. But that also is going to come into play when we talk about nutrition and sports nutrition, and when we have such a focus on carbohydrates and glycogen for females, especially certain times of the month. We will spare our glycogen. We won't actually try to access glycogen. We'll try to access fatty acids. So we'll talk about that in the nutrition section. But that is why we see more GI distress or more gastric distress in females compared to males, because at certain times we don't access our glycogen, we don't absorb carbs as efficiently, and so then with unabsorbed carbs you get GI distress. We'll get to that. I'll try not to jump ahead in my slides because I get real excited. Okay. If anyone has questions, you're more than welcome to ask questions as we go. I don't know if can I see questions, Corey, or can you just see questions?
I can see them. I was going to ask you if you can see them or not, but if you can't, feel free to throw them in there and I'll just jump out and stop you if there's
interrupt me. Okay, and then we'll also have a question period at the end. But we're going to jump right into the menstrual cycle. So let's just talk about the basics of the menstrual cycle. Day one of a typical menstrual cycle is your first day of bleeding. Often patients will have confusion about what is day one. It is your first day of bleeding. The textbook length of a menstrual cycle is 28 days. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only normal length of a menstrual cycle. A menstrual cycle can range from 21 to 40 days. But what we're looking for is consistency. So if you get your period on day 25 and you have always gotten your period on day 25, or it, most commonly comes day 25, day 26, and that's normal for you, then we consider it most likely healthy for you. Same with if you have a 34, 35 day cycle. If there's consistency there, then we consider that most likely healthy for your menstrual cycle. If there's a big fluctuation, so maybe 1 month you're day 21, 1 month you're day 40, the next month you're day 32, then there's things we have to take into consideration with respect to hormone balancing and disease potential. But 28 days is typical. Textbook ovulation is also right smack in the middle. So if you have a 28-day cycle and you cut that in half, we're looking at day 14 as the day of ovulation. Again, it's probably more uncommon to have ovulation happen right smack in the middle of a cycle. Some people ovulate early, some people ovulate late, but this is the textbook definition of it. The follicular phase is between days 1 and 14, and we're going to really focus in on what happens during each phase, because that's what's going to play into training the most. And the luteal phase is between day 15 and 28, or the second half of your cycle. Mid-cycle is also a phrase that we use largely in medicine when we're looking at labs, just to make sure we recognize the potential of hormones to spike, because they'll spike at a certain time. But let's look at this. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to look at each of these phases, and I want to make sure we're looking at the different hormones and how they're fluctuating in the phases. So this is what the conundrum is this up and down of the different hormones, but largely they behave in a similar way. So for our follicular phase, so this would be considered day one. Can you see my arrow? You can see my arrow down here? Okay. So this is considered day one. So first day of bleeding, right? Day one of your menstrual cycle. Largely our hormones are kind of a little bit flatlined during this time. And first we're going to follow estrogen. So estrogen's this nice blue curve here. You can see how estrogen climbs. And then right before day 14 or right before ovulation, you are going to have a big drop in your estrogen. During your luteal phase, it's going to climb a little bit again, and then it's going to taper off and kind of drop again right before we have our period. This drop right here in estrogen is really what stimulates the release of an egg. So that is the whole point of the rise and then the drop. The other hormone I want to point out here, because this is really impactful, is progesterone. So you can see progesterone is just kind of flat, starts to come up a little bit at ovulation. You can actually see temperature changing if you're doing temperature tracking in here because of progesterone and estrogen, but you're going to have flat, and then progesterone climbs, and then takes a real dramatic drop off right before your period. That dropping of progesterone is what causes us to start to bleed, because this phase here, I'm pointing, but you can't see me pointing. I gotta use my arrow. This is building the uterine lining. And then if no implantation happens from a fertilized egg, drops off. I'm going to point out too, this is what we will consider the high hormone phase when we do some more chatting, because progesterone's high, estrogen's not as high as it's been all month, but it is high for compared to where it starts. So this is our high hormone phase. This is our low hormone phase. We're going to differentiate these two a lot in the conversation. If you're moving more in the direction of elite athletics, we kind of chop it up even further and call it not just low and high hormone phase, but we're going to chop this up over the course of the entire menstrual cycle just to optimize everything. But like I said, high hormone phase, this is where your hormones climb leading up to ovulation, especially estrogen, but they're the highest the second half of your period, so that luteal phase. Low hormones are going to be shortly after ovulation. They're a little bit low, but really it's that first 5 to 7 days after you start bleeding, that follicular phase, we will consider low hormone phase. Things we don't necessarily have to worry about, depending on what time of the month it is for us, are key performance indicators like VO2 max, which is a good indicator of cardiovascular fitness largely, and oxygen carrying capacity. It's not going to change much with fluctuating hormones, same as lactate threshold. Those things won't really change. So we're not going to talk about those, but we will talk about estrogen and progesterone and how they impact especially muscle and adaptation to sport. So estrogen is important, of course. Estrogen influences how we build calcium and therefore how we build bone. It helps us to maintain healthy blood cholesterol levels, helps us to maintain vaginal tissue density and ecology as we move through ages and stages of life and estrogen starts to drop. The density of the vaginal tissue in the canal, it gets very thin, and so you can have easy tearing, but kind of compounded with that, because estrogen has dropped, the pH of the vaginal canal changes too, and that changes the microbiome of the vaginal flora. So you kind of have this, I'll say snowballing probably a lot, but you have kind of a snowballing of symptoms that'll happen, because not only are we changing tissue density, but we're also changing microflora. So those are things we make sure we support through perimenopause and menopause. Supports your metabolism and your blood sugar regulation. Estrogen actually helps us to shuttle sugars into our cell. And then this is really important for training. Estrogen is going to regulate satellite cell function. Satellite cells are stem cell parts of skeletal muscle. So when we're thinking about maintaining lean muscle mass or building lean muscle mass, we need good supplies of estrogen. If you take estrogen away in a laboratory setting, you actually decrease your ability to regenerate these skeletal muscle cells. When we talk about perimenopause and menopause, which we'll get to, the best way to regenerate these cells in the absence of estrogen, because eventually we will all have less estrogen as we move through life. The best way to replace that is through resistance training, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Estrogen also impacts collagenous tissue, so collagen. What happens if you take away estrogen again, or you watch estrogen decline, is you see a degradation to tendon tissue. So tendons hold your muscles to your bone. So this is why, again, as we move through ages and stages of life, we start to feel achier. We start to have those kind of big tendon issues, tendonitis. You'll hear a lot, aches and pains, but even injury can happen as we decrease our estrogen supply. So it's really important in practice to make sure that we are doing what estrogen was supposed to do when we don't have as much estrogen. Not necessarily replacing estrogen, but taking over its job the way we know how as we move through life. But let's talk about estrogen during our high hormone phase. So remember, right before ovulation, our estrogen is as high as it's going to get. But then also during that luteal phase, estrogen has climbed pretty high again. Estrogen causes us to spare glycogen, meaning it is very challenging to hit high intensities when our estrogen is high. So if you've ever been working out and you were hitting great intensities, you're just hitting the mark, and then all of a sudden you fall completely flat and you can't figure out, why am I not able to hit these intensities I just hit 5-7 days ago? It's usually because your estrogen has climbed and it's not letting you access glycogen the same way you could when it was low. So how we train and how we compensate for that is we make sure that when we are in our higher estrogen phase, we use more carbohydrate for fuel. So glycogen is stored carbohydrate. If we can't access that, we can give acute sources of carbohydrate. So we have carbohydrates to access during the high estrogen times. If you're low on carbs, you're going to bonk or you're going to crash because your body can't get that glycogen to make your energy. So if you're wanting to train hard during your high hormone phase, just make sure that you're preparing yourself with good nutrition, or your hormones will actually be quite catabolic and they'll eat into your lean muscle tissue. In your high hormone phase, when estrogen is high, you need to focus on longer recovery, because recovery is slower. It takes longer to regenerate your tissue and be able to tap into proper energy stores again. That's estrogen. Let's talk about progesterone, the importance of progesterone. The main goal of progesterone is to create a healthy and strong uterine lining. This supports a fertilized egg, turns into an embryo, turns into a fetus. But if you think about female physiology, everything about female physiology is geared towards reproduction and continuing existence. And so anything that happens with our hormones is because of whether or not over the course of the month we have fertilized an egg and can either carry it through to pregnancy and a full-term pregnancy or not. Progesterone supports bone density, again, like estrogen did, supports metabolism and blood sugar, similar to how estrogen did. But I really like to point out progesterone really is impactful on our mental health. So if you see progesterone drop, it is our content hormone, it is our happy hormone. And a lot of times when I have cases of anxiety or depression in the office, we check hormones, progesterone is really, really low. So we figure out how to bring that back up, and it changes things about mood. Okay, so progesterone during our high hormone phase, progesterone is catabolic. It wants to break things down for some anabolic purposes, for some building purposes. It wants to break things down to collect the building materials for the uterine lining. So this means protein stores specifically. If we do not have enough amino acid, which amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. If we don't have enough amino acids in our body during our high progesterone phase, progesterone will break down lean mass, and it will take from lean muscle to supply the uterine lining with amino acids. Progesterone will also take from your carbohydrate stores and shuttle everything it can into building that uterine lining. So in this high hormone phase, and again, remember, this is that luteal phase, progesterone has decided to skyrocket. In the high progesterone phase, because it is so catabolic, we are trying not to enhance that catabolic nature. We are trying very hard not to PR or PB. We don't want personal records. We don't want personal bests when estrogen and progesterone are peaking. And I know it's pretty common to have kind of like a 4-week training build, a training block where we build. But you can imagine how much of, I don't want to say damage, but how it's not beneficial to be peaking, especially when your hormones are also peaking, because they're focused on one thing. They're focused on that uterine lining, and they will break down any gains that you were trying to make to build the uterine lining, unless you can supply the right nutrition. So in the high hormone phase, we absolutely need extra branch chain amino acids and protein so that we can maintain lean mass. We're not trying to build it. We're just at least trying to maintain it. The most crucial protein during high hormone phase is going to be right after we exercise. So within 30 to 40 minutes of finishing up your training, you're taking in at least 30 to 40 grams of protein. We always say real food first, but this could be a shake. This could be a protein bar. You want to capture that 30 to 40 minute window so that you don't move more into that catabolic nature of progesterone. So with those two things in mind, high hormone phase, low hormone phase in mind, training and timing. Training or racing during the high hormone phase, estrogen wants to turn down your capacity to build muscle. Progesterone wants to turn up your capacity to break down your muscle. So you can see our hormones kind of are working against us unless we're supplying them with good, really good nutrition. And the follicular phase is when we are pushing the hardest. This is when you're having your personal best, your PRs, you're doing your heavy lifting, you're doing your sprinting, you're doing your high intensity workouts. This is during follicular phase, the first half of the month. Luteal phase, your endurance capacity is a little bit lower, but we're working more with that steady state, low, moderate intensity, and optimal recovery. We can work on maintenance, we can work on technique, and we have to recover really hard in luteal phase. So those are things to take into consideration very generally as to when to push, when to PR, when to PB, and when to take it a little bit easy and work more on technique. So you say, well, what happens if my race is right smack when I'm in my high hormone phase? There are things you can do nutritionally if race day just happens to be when you feel the most flat. And most females are going to feel really flat in that high hormone phase. Some females are going to feel really flat right before ovulation. We work with when you feel most flat. But what do you do if your race day is on that day? You can use supplements to really support your ability to tap into your energy stores. So we use things like magnesium, we use zinc, we use extra omega fatty acids, because remember, we're not going to tap into glycogen as effectively if our estrogen is high. So if we can supply more fatty acids, we will use those for fuel. And you do those for about 7 days leading up to your cycle. And then, of course, we need extra branch chain amino acids during this time. They are going to actually cross the blood-brain barrier and prevent the fatigue during our high hormone phase. So this isn't just if you're racing or training that day. You can do this now, and we'll talk about that in the nutrition section. In training, if you're in your high hormone phase, we want you consuming more carbs per hour, just because you're not going to be accessing glycogen. amounts will come in the nutrition section. We're not hyper saturating the body with carbs because we can't absorb them as well, but we're still taking in more. I think I can see a question. Is that a question up there? Jennifer James, what kind of branched chain amino acids do you recommend? There are so many different ones. Good question. So with respect to branched chain amino acids, I think I can close this off here now. With respect to branched chain amino acids, basically we're looking for 3 amino acids here. We're looking for leucine, isoleucine, and valine. These 3 branched chain amino acids are the most important. So you want to find a product that has those 3. Most of the products do, and then you want nothing else with it. So we don't need it to be flavored, really. We don't need the xylitol. We don't need the stevia with it, because that's going to change things about accessing glycogen and insulins anyway. So if you can look for branched chain amino acids that are leucine, isoleucine, and valine, most important. And fermented is really good too, just because they're going to help absorb the rate of absorption if they are already fermented. If that's helpful. Oh, another question. Oh, thank you. Okay. It was the question. She said, thank you. Can you guys see the question when I click on it? Yeah. Technology. Okay, let's keep going. The entire point of training, the whole reason we're training, is to produce adaptation, and we need recovery for that. So the point of training is to get better, right? That's adaptation. We apply a stress, we apply a sympathetic load, and then we rebuild after that, and then we adapt to that same load because we've rebuilt. But you must have sufficient recovery in order for the adaptation to happen. And like we said, in your high hormone phase, we recover a lot slower. So you do need to give yourself grace to recover a little bit longer so that your training makes sense. If you just keep going at the same schedule without proper recovery, you won't have adaptation, and then you'll just stay kind of in the same space. What does recovery mean? We talk about recovery all the time. Training is sympathetic, meaning it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight nervous system. It's that when you get that real push to work really hard and that stress, that is sympathetic. Parasympathetic is the opposite of that, and being in that state is recovery. Parasympathetic is when we're resting, is when we're digesting, is when everything tends to calm down. As women and as females, we tend to move into a sympathetic state. And this even happens with training. We train in the morning, we move right into sympathetic first thing in the morning, and then we stay there. We don't give ourselves time to sit down, take a minute. And I get it. Sometimes we don't have time, but we do need to make time to at least take 5 or 10 minutes to come back into a parasympathetic state. We'll talk about that here. The most important things for recovery are sleep and nutrition. Those are number 1. You've heard up and down everything about cold water plunging probably, and maybe there's some of you who do cold water plunging. I'm a big fan of it, but I also want to make sure that I make you aware that in female physiology, our shiver response and our shiver reflex is actually at 15 degrees Celsius. So we don't even necessarily have to drop that tub of water down to the 3-4 degrees, which comes from male data. We can comfortably be in a 15-degree tub of water and still have the same benefits from cold water immersion. Cold water immersion is really good for female physiology right after we exercise, because we actually vasodilate after we exercise, where men vasoconstrict. And if you can vasoconstrict after you exercise, that's going to send blood to the core, and that's going to help you recover a lot faster. We tend to vasodilate after exercise, so anything we can do to help us vasoconstrict and bring blood back to the core instead of in our periphery is going to be supportive. And again, that parasympathetic response. Focus for 5 or 10 minutes after you're done your training on breathing, focus on sounds that are around you, focus on meditating, just for that 5 or 10 minutes to bring you into that really restful, digesting space so that you can actually recover. I do want to talk about missing a period, because it's not uncommon for female athletes to miss several periods or even stop having periods altogether while training. Presuming that we're not in perimenopause or surgical menopause or actual natural menopause, this is most commonly due to something called RED-S, which is relative energy deficiency in sport. If you have lost your menstrual cycle due to training, it's not a healthy position to be in, and it's always because of a lack of nutrition. So if that's the case, it seems like a nice break, a little holiday from having to have your period because you're training hard, but it's not actually beneficial to you health-wise. So we work on your nutrition to make sure we bring that back. And I also want to make sure we touch on the impact of hormonal birth control, because that throws a whole new layer into what happens with hormonal birth control. So you're cycling, your menstrual cycle, if you're having a cycle while on hormonal birth control, it's not actually a menstrual cycle, it's just breakthrough bleeding because you've taken away something that's stopping you from having a period. So what I want to make sure I touch on is OCP, so oral contraceptive pills or birth control pills, when they're combined OCP, so we're talking about estrogen plus progesterone type birth control pills, they are quite inflammatory. They really increase your oxidative stress. They really inhibit your adaptation to sport. So in research, after 10-week trial, they put female athletes, some who were on OCP and some who were not, through the exact same training program. Those who were not on birth control gained 3.5 pounds of lean mass. Those who were on combined birth control only gained 0.5 pound of lean mass. So they're working just as hard for not a lot of gain. And the other interesting thing that happened with that trial was that even though they gained lean mass, they did not gain strength in association with the lean mass. So there are a lot of limitations because you gain the lean mass, but you don't adapt, and there's a lot of inflammatory markers. It really does hinder your performance. Yes, it gives you control over when you have your period and fertility, but you lose a lot of control with respect to what your body's naturally doing. So what should you do? Best case scenario is we're taking nothing and we're just using temperature tracking to prevent pregnancies. I won't go into detail on that, but if you have questions about how to use temperature tracking, I'm very happy to talk to you about it. Second to that, if you really want to make sure you have a parameter in place, we can use an IUD. That is more of a localized progestin dose instead of something that's systemic. So it's not something you're taking orally, it's just kind of localized to where it needs to work. And third best case scenario would be using a progestin only mini pill. It's less likely to impact your gains like if you were using estrogen and progesterone in a combined oral contraceptive pill. Any questions for up to this point? I'm talking a mile a minute, I think, but it's because I'm trying to get through quite a bit. Everybody good? Thumbs up. Okay, so let's talk about nutrition. Our hormones predispose us to using energy differently during exercise. I think it was probably exactly this same time last year we did a talk on sports nutrition. And the information that I presented in that topic was very generalized and very much male data heavy. So this is we touched a little bit on hormones, like barely anything. I'm so glad we're having this conversation today so that we can reframe and regroup. Okay, nutrition, carbohydrates. Surprise from the sports medicine industry. with female data, carb loading doesn't work for women. It doesn't really work, especially in our high hormone luteal phase. So when estrogen and progesterone are high, you have carb loaded, and then what happens? Estrogen and progesterone are just going to take those carbs and put them in protein to make your endometrial lining. So instead of us carb loading and being able to absorb those carbs and turn them into glycogen, we actually have a decreased capacity, like I said, to absorb the carbohydrates. And then we see more GI distress. Because when estrogen's high and progesterone are high, our body is very sensitive to carbohydrate, so we won't absorb it, especially fructose-based sugars. So things like fruits and other products that are made with fructose. Instead, what's very, very, very beneficial for a female in sport is to increase your total carbohydrate intake in your meals. So instead of carb loading night before or breakfast before, you're going to just take in that extra carbohydrate over the course of your meals, and especially day of racing or training. It's just going to help your body to have more carbohydrate availability. And we do have to increase our calories during luteal phase anyways, especially from carbs and protein. We're not talking about increasing calories by like 1,000 or 1,500. We're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 extra calories per day during your luteal phase from carbs and protein. But either way, carb loading isn't going to be beneficial for us. More beneficial to have more carbs the day before over the whole course of the day, and day of work them into your race day or training. So what does that mean from a gram per gram perspective? During our high hormone phase, again, we're talking about between ovulation and, 7 to 5 days before our menstrual cycle, we're going to aim for 0.45 grams of carb per pound of body weight. So if you are a 135-pound female, you're looking at around 60 grams of carb per hour in your high hormone phase. In your low hormone phase, we're aiming for 0.35 grams of carbohydrate per pound of body weight per hour. So if you're a 135-pound woman, then you're at 47 grams of carb per hour. These carbs are going to be used for fuel. We're using the majority of every other carb in our body for building that endometrial lining. The extra ones we take in day of and while we're training are going to help us have energy. Post-training, super, super important, especially if your training was endurance training. We're aiming for 0.35 grams of carb per pound of body weight. Again, this 135-pound woman is looking at, same as in your low hormone phase, about 30 or 47 grams of carbs per hour. That's independent of the phase. Protein. I'm going to say the word protein a lot. I think we hyped up protein probably in the 80s and 90s, and then we downplayed protein in the early 2000s. But I think what we should have been downplaying was all protein from all animal sources, especially high-fat animal sources, like not grass-fed fats. So protein is still super important. And when I talk about protein, I don't necessarily mean you have to get it from animal sources, and I don't necessarily mean you have to get it from plant sources, but just make sure that they're complete. But I will say, in the literature and in sport medicine and in female physiology, we thrive on an increase in protein, and there's more and more research coming out in that direction. And this is with respect to female athletes, so non-sedentary females. Broadly speaking, women should aim for 1.7 to 2.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So if you want to figure out how many your weight from pounds to kilograms, you just divide it. Women in menopause, perimenopause, and menopause, in that transition time, we should target for the higher end of that range. We need more protein in perimenopause and menopause because to take the place of estrogen, we need to build more lean mass. So what do you need to build lean mass? You need protein. Equally important to how much protein we're taking in is the timing of that protein. Our bodies actually respond really well to an even distribution of protein throughout the day. So we're not great at storing protein, but if we can give ourselves lots of protein over the course of the day, then we are going to feel so much better, have so much more energy production, and balance our hormones so much better. If you are a premenopausal female, so this is kind of under the age of 40, basically, we're talking about, we're going to aim for 30 grams of protein within 30 to 45 minutes after exercise, and then regular doses of 30 to 40 grams per meal and 15 to 20 grams as your snack. Peri and postmenopausal females, we have a lot of anabolic resistance, so we can take in protein, but it won't build lean mass as efficiently as it used to when we were premenopausal. So we're aiming to have our post-exercise protein closer to 40 grams, still within that 30 to 45 minute window. And something that I'll usually say is 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking. When we wake up, our adrenal glands start to produce cortisol, which is our stress hormone, but also gives us energy to get up and go. In that very first 30 minutes, when we wake up, cortisol should be rising to be at its peak for the whole day. To support cortisol production, stress hormone production, so it's not too high and not dramatically low, where we have no energy, where we're super flat when we wake up in the morning, you take in protein, and that supports this really balanced, beautiful production of cortisol, which will also play into estrogen, progesterone, testosterone production over the course of the day. So what do I say about nutrition and what should we focus on? Obviously, lifestyle instead of trends is what's important. Carnivore is a really big trend right now. And I have a lot of patients on carnivore, and they feel good for a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks. Carnivore makes you feel better, not necessarily because of what you're introducing, but it's because of what you've taken away. So we want to figure out why you're not getting energy from regular foods. Anyway, I'll digress from carnivore. Colorful fruit and vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, grass-fed proteins if you're using animal-based. Plant-based is fine as long as it's good high-quality protein, and we add the branched chain amino acids for leucine. My very favorite protein when we're not talking about food sources is pea protein, and I've mentioned that before. The liver loves pea protein. The liver does not like whey protein. Whey protein is inflammatory to the liver, and the liver is processing our hormones and literally everything that comes through our body. The liver is responsible for processing it and detoxing it. So I'm a big fan of pea protein. One thing that we're finding out about pea protein is it's not as an efficient store of leucine. It has some, but not a lot. So if you're using pea protein, you can even double the impact by adding branched chain amino acids to that. We want to support our gut microbiome, and these foods, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, these support a beautiful microbiome. This is a type of phyla that you can see when you're purchasing probiotics. You'll see some called lactobacillus, and then you'll see some called bacillus. This is the same type of phyla. Those are really good for building lean body mass and decreasing body fat. And then don't eat 2 hours before bed. That will improve your sleep. It will take you from that sympathetic space, move you into parasympathetic space, and allow you to actually recover. Now, if you're starving before bed, that means you probably need to eat more calories throughout the day, but we try not to eat after dinner. Just drink some tea. Okay, two pretty popular things, and I might make some enemies here, but I'm just going to give you the data. Intermittent fasting and keto. I have the big word nope on there. If you are trying fasted training, it is not a good fit for women. It's not a good fit for women. If we drop below 45 calories per kilogram of body weight, metabolic changes start to happen within 4 days. So if we decide to try intermittent fasting and you've got this massive window where you wake up at 8 and then you're not eating till 1 or 2, you are actually sending your body into metabolic distress and into that sympathetic space. So what happens is we start after 4 days to downregulate really, really important hormones. We start to downregulate luteinizing hormone, LH, FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, the thyroid hormone. We really do ourselves some metabolic damage with intermittent fasting. The female body does not want to be in sympathetic overdrive. So if you can even just present it with something when you wake up or something before training, it will be in a calmer space, knowing that there is fuel coming in. Again, right here, I say it. 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up is your ideal way to set up your hormone, because hormones are produced in a pulsing fashion. It sets up your body in a beautiful way to produce hormones in a very balanced fashion over the whole day. And if you don't want to do 30 grams of protein, please at very least get 15 to 20 grams of protein before your training. And keto. I'm not a fan of keto. When women drop low in their carbs, same things happen. Our metabolic pathways, our hormones go bonkers. When we don't have carbs, we actually have a big decrease in our estradiol, and we have an increase in our estrone and our cortisol. So we produce estrogen largely from our ovaries, some from our adrenal glands and some from our liver. Largely from our ovaries, we produce estrogen. Then estrogen goes to the liver. It's metabolized and turned into 3 different types of estrogen. The one type of estrogen that we look at in a lab setting predominantly is estradiol. It's our supportive type of estrogen. The one we don't really want to see is esterone. That is the one that will potentiate things like breast cancer. It's stored in fatty tissue, and if we drop our carbs, we actually increase our esterone, and we increase a secretion of esterone, and then we're going to signal the body to actually store more fat. It also amps up our cortisol. And so we don't want that, because that's our stress hormone. A rise in cortisol also signals fat storage under stress. But what about, I just want to point this out, because what about all the amazing data that we have from intermittent fasting? And yes, I have friends who did keto and they felt amazing while they did it. First of all, it's largely male data that we have for the clinical trials. And when there is female data, what we have to take into consideration is the population. The female data in these studies are typically from overweight or obese females, and they're sedentary. So the clinical trials on intermittent fasting and keto are disease driven. So you have to have a diseased population who, of course, could benefit most likely from shifts like this. So I'm not saying nope for everybody. There is a time and a place for intermittent fasting and for keto in the female population, but I am saying nope for anyone who's participating as an athlete. And if you engage in sport on purpose, you are allowed to call yourself an athlete. And if you're in a triathlon club, there's a good chance you're training more than someone who's sedentary. So there's good data, not good data for sport. Some supplements to consider. I love creatine. So much data coming out about creatine right now, how it can really help us to get energy, how it can really help us to balance out our hormones. There are a lot of studies right now with respect to creatine and females and depression. So I love creatine. I'll hear it from patients though, when they start taking creatine, they say, I don't like it. I just feel boggy. I feel like I've put on a lot of water weight. And that's a thing that creatine can do. So instead of having a loading phase of creatine, which is where you take 5 grams a day for a couple of weeks straight, we just dial that right back. We start really low dose. We start about 1 to 2 grams per day, and that's absolutely supportive enough to encourage these changes. especially in perimenopausal and menopausal females. Please take some creatine. I do see a lot of athletes that have iron deficiency. And I've said this before, test, don't guess. So even with iron, I mean, it's easy to say if you have a heavy period, you're probably iron deficient. Or if you had a heavy period and now you're menopausal, you're probably still iron deficient. And because you train at a higher level, you're probably iron deficient. But again, I prefer for things like this that you test it and make sure. But if you do want to use some iron, 25 to 35 grams of iron bisglycinate. Bisglycinate's my favorite form because it doesn't cause constipation or that kind of gut rot feeling that some iron can cause. And then we've talked about branched chain amino acids, just about 1 scoop per day. If you don't like using it every day, you can just use it during your luteal phase. If you're peri or postmenopausal, you may use that every day. I am going to skip over sleep for a minute, but I will say we have to consider sleep the same way we consider nutrition. If we have increased our training and therefore increased our nutrition, we should also increase our sleep. Just make sure you take that little nugget away because it's just as important as changing your nutrition. And tart cherry juice, half hour before bed, can help your melatonin production. Okay, any questions before I jump into perimenopause, menopause? No? Somehow in Western medicine and in just Western life in general, we have this idea that menopause is something that needs to be stopped and we shouldn't talk about it and we should move away from it. And there's this really strong push for women to stay young. And it causes a lot of mental distress as we move through ages and stages of life. I feel that we should have a mind shift towards perimenopause and menopause. It is the time when we get to stop being those who are responsible for repopulating the earth, and we get to be responsible for working hard and supporting those who are now in the reproductive stage with our strength. And it's interesting because we move into menopause, perimenopause, and we just think about, okay, that's it. Life's done. We're supposed to be sedentary. We're supposed to just stop pursuing things. But if you look at female physiology, we actually should be in the prime of our time when we're in perimenopause and menopause. That is when we get to be the strongest, the absolute strongest, and have the most lean muscle mass if we fuel it right and if we train it right. So we need to have a mind shift towards menopause and really try to celebrate it like they do in other countries. We just don't do it here. So I just want to make sure I say that. Menopause and perimenopause. So really after the age of 40, and sometimes it can be a little earlier, or it could be early 40s, mid 40s, we can move into perimenopause. Perimenopause is the stage that's leading up to menopause, when you start to see body composition changes, when you start to see changes in your period. So maybe it's heavier, maybe it's lighter, maybe it's longer, maybe it's shorter. Our sleep patterns tend to be disrupted. We start putting on body fat, or belly fat, we're not recovering well. And again, no wonder westernized cultures, want us to be a little bit afraid of this time. It's not something to be afraid of. It's just something we have to know how to work with. So that is all perimenopause. Menopause is one date on the calendar. It's 365 days after we had our last period. So it's literally just one day you check a box, and that is menopause. So how do we work with perimenopause and menopause when it comes to training? Yes, we can replace estrogen, but I don't think we should always be trying to replace estrogen from a HRT perspective, like hormone replacement therapy or supplemental perspective. If your symptoms of menopause or perimenopause are dramatic and influencing the quality of your life, then of course we can work in that direction. And I've prescribed enough to patients to help them in times like that. But we should really embrace that our estrogen is starting to decline and transition what we do in training so that we get to replace what estrogen was doing. So estrogen is really tied to the myosin filaments and muscle contraction. And so as we lose estrogen and our estrogen starts to decline, we start to see the capacity of muscle contraction also go down, and our ability to maintain lean mass go down. Our ability to synthesize protein also go down unless we replace it with something different. What we found in female physiology is the best way to replace that mechanism that where estrogen was impacting is to go after it from a neuromuscular perspective. So we find ways to contract the muscles in specific ways so that you keep those myosin contractions strong and you keep that lean mass maintained and you keep protein synthesis high. So the way we do that is actually with heavy lifting. So I said this is the time of our life when we get to be the strongest. This is when we need to be the strongest to replace what estrogen has done. Heavy lifting plus amino acids plus those proteins or branched chain amino acids is how we support the body the way estrogen used to support it. So let's talk about that. So HIIT training is an excellent example of what we can do to support what estrogen was doing. And this is true HIIT training. So this is like a Tabata is a true HIIT training, or when you are going all out for 15 to 20 seconds, and then you actually take a good amount of time to recover, that's going to be supportive of estrogen. Or you push as hard as possible for 15 to 20 seconds, recover for 10 seconds, repeat that 6 or 8 times, and then rest for a full 5 minutes. That will retrain your neuromuscular connections to do exactly what the estrogen was doing. I'll have patients that tell me they get this feeling of being squishy overnight when they move into menopause, and they just all of a sudden have these body fat transitions that happen. But then they come back and tell me that the workouts that they're doing are mostly like moderate intensity workouts, where it's kind of hard, kind of not hard. And you're just kind of hanging out there every single day for long periods of time. And we're not using interval training and we're not using strength training. You won't have that replacement of what estrogen was doing. So yes, your cortisol will come up and you'll have increase in body fat, especially adiposity in your midsection. So stay out of this zone. You can be there a little bit, but you really, really want to incorporate some more of this HIIT training and more of the heavy resistance. So lifting heavy means you're not able to do 8 to 15 reps. You're not able to do 10 to 15 reps of something. We're not doing body weight. We're not doing 10 to 15 reps. We're doing 3 to 5 exercises, 3 to 5 reps to failure. And that is how you reconnect that neuromuscular conditioning. And it's 3 to 5 minutes recovery. So you are taking a long time to recover, fully recover. And then you go back to your next set. Now, if you're someone who's never trained in the gym, of course, body weight is the safest place to start. You can move towards something like machines, but when you're ready to start using free weights and lifting, make sure you're moving to failure. You're working hard every time. It's high quality training and you're getting high quality recovery. We are very, very good at endurance. So we need to get the other stimulus because estrogen has left or is leaving. That's how we replace it. If you are in perimenopause or menopause, you got to eat more and you got to train less. No one wants to hear that. The train less part. Imagine trying to tell a triathlete to train less. But typically we're not eating enough. We still feel like calorie restriction and cardiovascular training is what's going to get us to be in that lean space we want to be in. It's not going to work if we're lacking estrogen, lacking progesterone. We need more protein because we become anabolically resistant to protein, so we don't use it as efficiently, so we need more. We need 2 to 2.3 grams of protein per kilogram per day. Regular doses at every meal. Well, what if I'm not hungry? Just give your body something. If you like having coffee when you first wake up in the morning, don't. Wait a little while, but at least have maybe some protein fortified coffee. You just put a scoop of protein powder in there and there's your protein fortified coffee. Your body will recognize it as nutrition coming in and be very happy with that. Okay, so my takeaway, if you're in perimenopause or menopause, or if you're over the age of 40, resistance training plus increased protein. It will make you a better endurance athlete. And probably there's some people shaking their head. No way, this can't be true. It can't be true because we've based everything off male data. But I guarantee if you try it, you're going to be impressed with your benefits to your endurance. Eat more. Bring in some high intensity work, bring in some weight training for your hormones, true HIIT training, sprinting and lifting, and increase your protein. You will be a machine in endurance sport. Takeaway for everybody else, train according to your hormone stage and your age and stage of life. If you know you're always flat during that middle part of your follicular phase or the middle part of your luteal phase, take it easy. Don't PR, don't PB, just train according to your hormones. And eat, please eat. Eat according to your hormone cycles. Those high hormone phases, we need more protein, we need more carbs, and recover. Please, if you want to make your training worth it, if you want to have those adaptations take place, make sure you recover hard if you're training hard. Increase your sleep with your increased training. Okay, like I said, iceberg. We just started dipping into things. But now I want to have some time for questions if anybody has questions. Now I'm going to take a sip of water. Corey, what were your thoughts?
I missed that lesson in grade 8 health class, so that was a good recap.
You didn't have it. You didn't have
I didn't actually.
No, you didn't. This is, I mean, you had male data generated in your direction, right? So,
it's I found passion in the science behind sport and training, and it never ceases to amaze me how much I don't know still about this topic and how quickly it's still, the research is still emerging and new things are being discovered. And
yeah,
what you presented today was, I said, a fantastic addition to, I would say, a little bit that I might have known. Hopefully everyone kind of feels similar, but yeah, I appreciate all that.
yeah, it's something that is emerging, having more female data in sport medicine. Thankfully, it's finally emerging, but it's probably only been a good 5 years since we've really, really gotten good data from all female cohorts and especially female athletes, as opposed to just females with disease. So it's good. And it's something to, remind everybody else to track your cycle, so that your coach could even be aware, if you say, hey, I'm like feeling so flat because I just hit, luteal phase, or I'm right smack in the middle of my luteal phase, then that makes a little bit of sense, So I think the Garmin Connect and maybe even Training Peaks, they let you track parts of your cycle. And you can even line it up where you can look at your data from Training Peaks and kind of see, okay, well, that makes sense that my, heart rate variability is moving up and down quite a bit here because I am high hormone phase. So you gotta take a break, but track your cycle. on some tracking app and then cross correlate it to days you don't feel good and days you feel great while training.
I was thinking about how many different training plans I have to change now, but I got to look into that Training Peaks thing. I don't know if I've seen that.
But that relies on the responsibility of your athletes, right? Like they need to
That's
make
right.
sure they let you know. But they do. They have to, like, because maybe somebody feels amazing when they're at their high hormone phase. That would, to me, clinically, that would mean they're probably not producing a lot of hormone to begin with. So they're finally just getting a good amount. But yeah, your female athletes have a responsibility to make sure you're aware of when am I feeling okay, or, am I perimenopausal, postmenopausal, and what do I need more of?
So, for those of us who don't, like, I had an ablation, so I haven't had a cycle forever. So, how would you ever know where you are in any of that?
Yeah, so if it's more of a surgical menopause, that's what ablation is, then you're largely just working with the menopausal information. So you're not necessarily producing estrogen, progesterone. You can look at those values in blood levels and see kind of where you're at, maybe do a couple blood tests over the course of a month and see if at any point you have spikes. Because when we talk about ablation, that's a localized surgery. As we move through ages and stages of life, when we're in our early 20s, the majority of our estrogen comes from our ovaries. And then as our ovaries stop producing, it comes from our adrenal glands. And then it also comes from the liver. So you still should, despite whatever happened from a localized surgery, have a production of estrogen, but you'd have to test it, blood lab testing, just to see where you're at. And if you're if it were free, because of course labs are never free, but if it were free and you could take a high performing female athlete and test their blood levels of estrogen, progesterone every day, just like we do with lactate testing as often as possible, I mean, you could overcome the world. That'd be amazing.
Maybe there's sponsorship for that.
Yeah, I'm going to call Red Bull after this. Let's see what they say. It would be such a game changer to know absolutes objectively where you're at. Yeah.
Okay, the hardest thing is the coffee. I'm just gonna throw that out there. Nobody wants to wait 30 minutes to have their coffee. I do it begrudgingly.
You can do it.
I just don't want to listen to Dale anymore.
It's been a week.
You know what? Eventually you're going to be at 2 hours and you're going to say, this is incredible. I feel amazing.
I really actually don't think that'll happen, but I love that. That's optimism.
But Kayla, your throwback was, we can't touch coffee. Don't touch. Don't change my coffee, whatever you do.